Welcome to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Bailey. This podcast celebrates the power of books and the joy of reading. In each episode, we talk with educators, librarians, families, authors, and literacy champions to explore one big question: what does reading inspire for you? Through stories, research, and real-world experiences from classrooms, libraries, and homes, we explore what literacy looks like and why it matters. Whether you're nurturing young readers, shaping learning spaces, or simply love a good book, we're glad you're here. Be sure to subscribe to get the latest episode. Let's get inspired. Today, I am interviewing Dr. Timothy Shanahan, who, similar to me, started out as a first grade teacher. He then became a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he founded the UIC Center for Literacy. He served as the president of the International Literacy Association, and he was on the advisory board for the National Institute for Literacy under Presidents Bush and Obama, and he was inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame in 2007. And a fun fact that I learned from his book is that he also hiked the Mount Everest base camp with his wife, Cindy. So welcome, Tim.
Good morning to you, Erin. Good to see you.
Thanks for coming. So as I just rattled off there, you've had an extraordinary career from classroom teacher to leading the national literacy panels and shaping literacy policy. Can you share for our listeners a little bit about how your early experiences influenced your views on reading instruction today?
Yeah, I started out as a tutor, and then a teacher's aide, and a classroom teacher, and a remedial reading teacher, and so on. And I think I probably I didn't hit the middle very much. I was either at the extreme of thinking I was an idiot and didn't know what I was doing, and why was I there? These poor kids, are being taught by me, and they should have a real teacher. To the other extreme of just super confident, I know this stuff, and just certain of how I was doing things was right. And I think both of those have had a long impact on me. That first part, that being uncertain of myself and sure that I'm not bringing value, has really, it's what made me go on to graduate school. It's what made me seek a doctorate and want to do research. Was really trying to make up for that, trying to figure out what I didn't know, and that really continues on today. And then on the other extreme, there were a lot of things I believed, and I believed them strongly. That doesn't make them right. It just, but I gripped to them. And they've actually become topics that I've ended up studying, that I question myself on. And so certainly one of my strongest initial beliefs was that writing was really important in kids' reading development. And that was correct. And yet it was a lot more complicated than I thought as a teacher, and that there were a lot of things I could have been issue about teaching kids at their levels and so on was something that I used in the classroom, and I was certain that that was why people thought I was a good teacher and all that kind of stuff. And yet, as I've studied it over the years, I found out that maybe that wasn't quite as clever an idea as I thought it was, and that I should have been doing some things better. And so, yeah, that those early experiences have turned out to be really useful. They've fueled my interest in learning, just to make sure I knew more, and they've given me topics to pursue that have turned out to be a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than I recognized when I was so certain of their, my simplistic ideas about them. So yeah, my early career has been really important to what I do today.
I think you hit on it. I mean, I worked with a lot of teachers, training teachers. I worked at a demonstration school where we had a residency model. And this is what I noticed. First year's teachers very clearly, admittedly, don't know what they're doing. Second year teachers, they're like, as long as I replicate what I did in the first year, I know I'll at least survive the year. And then third year teachers is where I always saw folks start to question themselves. What am I doing? Have I been doing everything wrong this whole time? And that's, a lot of times when folks go back to graduate school because they see a problem and they want to learn more about it.
Yeah, there really are two groups of teachers. They're the ones who get to that third year and go, I got this far, I'll just keep doing this. And there are the group you're talking about who goes, man, there's got to be more to it than this. And they tend to become really good teachers over time.
Yeah.
It's that's how it seems to work.
Yes. So we're here to talk about this book I'm holding up, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives. It's your newest book. I do want to pause for a moment for teachers who are listening to this, because I know I had to say this to myself, and I'm sure you did as well, Tim, is that take a deep breath. What you're about to hear in the conversation may challenge a lot of what you thought you knew about using instructional texts. And it's okay if you got it wrong. It's not because you knew you were doing something wrong and you continue to do it. You were trained on information that was incorrect. And that's what we're kind of here to debunk today. So starting with that, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, one of those things I talked about being in my early toolkit was I had learned to give informal reading inventories and how to get kids into different levels of books that would match their needs and all of that. And I taught with all the little groups of kids and all of that stuff I had been told to do and by people who I respected and who I still respect and admire. But frankly, I did that. And then when I became a college professor, I taught teachers how to do those things and insisted that that was the right way to go. So this was something I had spent a lot of time with over the years. And, it wasn't easy in those days. When I say in my early days, you have to understand that was almost 60 years ago that I was doing these things. And so, we didn't have all the little books, for example, that teachers have now to be able to level. And so I'd have to convince my school district to let me buy multiple basal reader programs so that I would have, different levels of books to be able to use without causing trouble. And so, and giving an informal reading inventory to every kid, I had more than 30 kids in a classroom in those days. And so, this took hours and hours and hours of work. So these were things that I really spent time on. When I was early in my professorial career and teaching teachers about things like this, I actually did for the first time, read the original study that had been used to set the criteria for determining whether a book was at a kid's instructional level. And I was stunned because it was as if they just made it up. It wasn't, I thought they would have tried to teach kids with books at that level and books at another level, and they found that kids did better. They didn't teach anybody anything. They just gave them a test and went, oh, that's their instructional level. It was like, ee. I wrote about it. Fortunately, I had enough integrity that I reported it, so I didn't hide this result, what I'd found out. But I never wanted to talk about it. I put that article in my bottom drawer and hope nobody would ever ask me. I mean, think about it, Erin. If I went into you work with teachers, you go in and you say, oh, look, this scheme was just made up. There's no evidence that it works. Uh, Hand is going to go up immediately. So what do we do? What's the alternative? I had no idea. I had no alternative, and so I didn't want to talk about it. And so I kind of left it there for years, just avoiding it. And then the Common Core state standards came along. Now I worked on the Common Core state standards, but I had nothing to do with this particular item that they essentially said that to be on grade level, to be accomplish the standards of your level, the things you had to do them with text within a certain range of difficulty. Standards had avoided that in every state for decades. I thought this is going to be wild. People are going to complain. This is going to be a huge problem. So I wanted to prepare myself for what was coming. And I started reading the research on this topic that had been conducted more recently. And I was stunned to find that the studies were saying that what we were doing wasn't helping kids, it was hurting kids. Kids were learning to read, but they weren't learning to read as well as they could have. Wow, this is right. We should be doing this. So I wrote about that. And I thought it would set off all kinds of big arguments. Crickets. It was quiet. That was a real problem because I assumed, okay, the publishers have bought into this. They're making sure the texts are hard enough. The school districts are buying into this. They're purchasing these materials and putting them in. The states have this set of standards. They're testing kids now at these levels. It's happening. They're going to do this. There's nothing more for me to do. And then I started seeing the teacher surveys coming in, nationwide. And what had happened, you'd think, wow, more and more teachers are teaching kids with grade level text. Went the other way. Fewer and fewer teachers were teaching kids with grade level text once it was the standard. Teachers having to confront difficult text with children were seeing that it was difficult, that the kids were having trouble with it, and they had no alternatives. They were right back where I had been 20 years before. This might be right, but we don't know what to do. By this point, I fortunately felt like I actually had a much better purchase on what should we be doing. And so I decided at that point we needed a book. We needed something that would both be substantial enough that policymakers and school administrators and so on could buy into and would understand fully, but also that would have enough practical direction that teachers and teacher educators could look and say, oh yeah, we could do that. This is manageable. It isn't, for so many years, if you go through reading textbooks, for teachers and so on, what you'll see is they didn't include anything about what do you do if the texts are hard for the kids. It was always move the kids to an easier text. It's malpractice not to. And therefore, there was nothing there for teachers. And so giving some practical guidance based on research and so on made a lot of sense. And so that's why I wrote the book. It really was something that we really need to take on if we actually want to raise reading achievement in the United States.
I'm picturing myself as a first grade teacher now, and I had the classroom library that was organized with the bins, A through Z kind of bins, and it was this is your independent reading level, so go to the level J box and pick out the level J book. And I know for teachers listening right now who have similar organization in their classroom, they are on the edge of their seats, like what are they supposed to do? So what do you hope is the outcome from your book for how teachers should help students find text?
Well, like I say, most states have standards now. A lot of them have gotten away from the Common Core, but they haven't gotten away from this notion of saying, gee, if you're a third grader, you should be able to read text with comprehension of, certain levels of difficulty. And they've got Lexiles and 3, 4, 5 other schemes that you can use to determine levels. And because these levels are far from perfect, they're ranges. It's not a single point. It's and they overlap a bit from grade level to grade level as well. So there's a lot of latitude, but there is a level of difficulty the state says that you should be aiming for. And the reason why that is essentially in the past, like when I was a teacher, long before you were, but when I was a teacher, the publishing companies pretty much set the levels however they chose to. And that had been true for more than 100 years at that point. Now there's actually a scheme in place that tells you what a third grade level book would be. Again, it's imperfect and so on, but it's wide enough and overlapping enough that it's very workable. And what that means is if we actually accomplish that, moving kids from level to level successfully, what you'll see is by the time kids leave high school, they'll have the levels of literacy that they need. And so it's really important that teachers uh, actually make sure kids accomplish the levels that are set for their grades. And what that means is if you had a book room, if you had all your curtains of books set up the way that you described or whatever, you don't have to throw any of that stuff away. It's not, oh, let's destroy this. It's let's figure out which ones fit my fifth grade or my second grade. It's not oh, everybody's at their own level, and I'm gonna, this kid should be working in an H book, and this kid should be working in an M book. No, no, you've got a range of books to work with, and all your kids should be working at those, and therefore, we might need to sort the books a little differently in terms of, which grades get which books and so on. But beyond that, it's the same books for the most part, and it's books though that are of a certain range of difficulty that you didn't have to worry about before. You were worried about trying to match it to the youngster in a particular way, and now you've got to match it to your grade level in a particular way, and then you have to adjust your instruction for those kids so that everybody has a chance of succeeding. That it's a big shift. It really is a very different way of looking at things.
So there are text levels or a range of text for a grade band, but the idea is that if you're in third grade, you should be reading within that range. You shouldn't be placed in a first grade level text because that's what you're able to read. So it's really on the teacher then. What needs to change is the teacher's level of scaffolding and instruction. The teacher serves as the scaffold, the text doesn't serve as the scaffold.
That's exactly right. And so, if you think about it, the way that we used to talk about this, and the way some people still do, is there are really only two variables in this problem. There's the youngster's reading level and there's the books level. And all we have to do is make sure that we've put the right book to each child. And if we do that, they're going to grow. They're going to make optimum gains in reading. That was the belief. The real issue, the real problem that we're dealing with is really a three variable problem. There's a book, and it has a level. There's a kid, and he or she has a level. And there's a teacher, and the teacher has to orchestrate how well the youngster can handle that text. Uh, Frankly, the scheme that's been in place for so long minimized the teacher's role. And essentially, the teacher was there more for when things go off the tracks than actually to having the book was going to teach kids, the reading was going to teach kids. The teacher wasn't going to have to do very much of it. That's a big shift.
Yes. And is it the same for content area reading? So let's say I'm a fifth grade teacher and I'm teaching my students about the American Revolution and I want to use a text to do that. Should it be a fifth grade level text, or if a student's reading more at a third grade level, can I differentiate the text because it's really about the content, not the reading?
Yeah, I think what you see in most schools is that teachers don't have multiple books to choose from when it comes to something like teaching the American Revolution. And so they might have a textbook or, some approved set of books that are tend to be grade level. And what teachers have done with those over the years is either read those to the kids, had the best readers read it to everybody, round robin kind of style, just made the book optional and just told the kids what they needed to learn, did a PowerPoint or whatever. Um, or just ignored the fact that the kids couldn't handle it and didn't know what they were doing with it. And you go, well, none of those are going to work. And so, what reading people like me would have told them years ago is, oh, you have to find an easier book. There are easier books about the American Revolution. And there probably are, but they don't go to the same level of depth in the content. They don't have the level of detail. And so we're cutting kids off from the curriculum. And so, yeah, I would really argue that the same kinds of techniques that teachers can use to scaffold the reading book are the same kinds of things that they could be doing with the history book and the science book. Not saying there are no adjustments needed or there aren't some issues different in those situations, but the same notion is in place. Instead of avoiding dealing with grade level text, we need to enable kids to deal with a grade level text.
Yeah, that makes it. I mean, and what do you think about the use of AI to differentiate text? Because I see that a lot too in webinars that I go to is you can use AI to, and I'm not saying to do this, but feed in your text about the American Revolution and say, now make this at a third grade level so my students can read it better. What is your recommendation there?
Uh, Grab your wallet and run. It's 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 terrible. It scares the heck out of me. I talked to a lawyer recently who was saying, well, given that we have AI and the things AI can do, there's no need to teach people to read anymore. They don't need to know how to read. And I think this is sort of falls under that same notion. Well, gee, the kid can't handle a fifth grade book. I'm not going to teach him to do it. I'm just going to move him. I can have this text rewritten. And in fact, gee, kids could use AI. They could just, if they need to read a book, they could just feed it in and have the AI read it to them, or dumb it down. Gee, I can't read at all. Dumb it down to a first grade level. What the heck? The fact is what we've known for years and years and years. When you make text easy, when you reduce the difficulty of a text by the kinds of changes that we tend to make when we edit them, quite often what happens is the texts don't actually even get easier. They actually get harder,
Mhm.
because often you cut away a lot of the detail. You make sure that certain words aren't repeated as often and so on because they have too many syllables. And so we want the thing to look easier. And what happens is the texts get, well, actually less understandable. There are a number of studies where people have rewritten text to make them more understandable, and their Lexile levels go up. They're actually, well, they predict that it'll be less understandable. They're using harder words, they're using longer sentences, and so on. And yet, oops, the kids actually do better with those harder texts. And so, I nobody has tested the ability of AI to actually come up with texts that are easier and actually communicate the same information, and without making it fuzzier or less specific or whatever. So I think it's a big mistake for schools to do that. What I'd much rather have a school do is feed the text in and ask it, what's going to make this difficult
Mm.
for a reader? What are the least the words that are least familiar to most people? What sentences are likely to be more complicated and could trip somebody up? What ideas are harder to link across the text? And let AI tell you, because it can do some really good analyses of those kinds of things. Not perfect again, but still quite good, which would save teachers a lot of time or save publishers a lot of time. But then somebody has to actually teach the kids how to deal with that rather than how could we keep the kids from having to deal with it.
That is wonderful advice. I know teachers are going to appreciate that. And it goes back to what we said earlier is you as the teacher, you're scaffolding your instruction. You're not scaffolding the text. So you can use AI to figure out. I teach mostly multilingual learners. Are there any idioms in this text that I need to front load or pre-teach or stop when we
Hmm.
get to it and monitor and clarify for understanding rather than just make this into an easier text?
Exactly. What we've done for years is found ways of avoiding the difficulties. And the problem is the difficulties are what you have to learn to deal with. And so if I always make sure that you don't have that difficulty, you're only going to have them when you're on your own, and you're not going to know what to do with them.
Mhm.
And so what we should be doing is turning that around and saying, oh no, I want kids to have difficulties with the text when they're dealing with them with my assistance, because I can make sure that they surmount it. I can show them what to do when they get into that kind of a spot. And over time, I can make them good at that. I can, build a proficiency so that these kids aren't afraid of hard text, that they're able to handle it. Um, Kids actually prefer it. That's one of the interesting things. They would much rather be reading the harder text than the ones we've been putting them in.
I believe it, especially when the topic, is interesting to them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I want to get back to kindergarten and first grade because, as I mentioned, I'm a first grade teacher and I'm just sweating right now of what kind of text do I use to teach reading. So from your book, most of the studies that you cite for using grade level text are second grade through high school. What kind of text should kindergarten and first grade teachers be using to really build up those foundational reading skills?
Yeah, I do think it's different for beginners than it is later on. It's certainly, and your point is well taken. There are absolutely no studies with beginning readers saying that you need to place them in much harder text. That's something that the studies begin at second grade. So I always tell teachers, if the youngsters can read, I'd say like an average end of year first grader, they're ready to handle grade level text from then on. If they're lower than that, they're still trying to get the basics of decoding. Now, it isn't that once you're done with first grade, you're done with learning to decode. That goes on, for a lot longer. But you've got the foundations, you've got the basics of it, you understand the principles of it, and you have some of the more common patterns under your belt. And so that's all to the good. For a young reader, you probably did it as well. I'd ask my first graders what made reading hard, and they'd tell you the words. And in fact, it is the words that make things hard for a beginner. They can't read the words. The no, If you wanted the text to be much harder for a first grader, the way you would do that wouldn't be, oh, let's get unfamiliar content or really complicated sentences. It would be, let's make the text less decodable. In other words, use words that have spelling patterns that the kids haven't confronted yet and don't have any idea how to deal with. And make sure when you do introduce words that you don't repeat them very often. If you do those things, you're going to make sure that text is really hard, but you're also going to slow down the kids' progress in learning to decode. And that's not what we want to do. So I would say with beginners, you want texts that have a reasonably high degree of decodability. People go a little crazy with this.
They
It's not,
sure
oh,
do.
everything has to be perfect. Yeah, no, you don't have to do that. And the research is really clear you don't have to do that. But it doesn't make sense to teach kids a skill and then not give them any chance to practice it.
Mhm.
And so, decodable text allow me to give kids a more intensive degree of practice with a particular pattern or, spelling, rule or whatever, that frankly, than they would in just any ordinary text. And so it's really useful to have that high decodability. It's also very useful to have words in there that don't necessarily fit the patterns. Maybe they're exceptions. The example I often use is, oh, we teach kids that pattern vowel, consonant, silent E. If you have that word, that has that pattern, the vowel is going to say its name. It'll be a long vowel or a stressed vowel, and so if you come to the word came, you know exactly what to do with that A because of the E sound, or those kinds of things. Well, that does work a lot, and it's very useful. It's a good pattern to learn. but there are exceptions to it. And so what about the word done? What about the word come? What about, those different words? Well, gee, they have that spelling pattern, but they don't actually lead to that same pronunciation. I would love to see decodable texts that throw in some words like that so the kids have to distinguish. But that isn't how they tend to do it. So we kind of overdo the decodability, but you do want kids to see those patterns a lot. And then the second thing is, especially for words that either are exceptions or aren't going to follow the pattern, the word of, the word the, those words need to come up a lot and they need to be repeated frequently. And if you have other words more complicated, we want to use the word dinosaur. Nothing wrong with using the word dinosaur with a first grader, unless you're only going to show it to them a couple times in the story. That word dinosaur should come up a lot, so that it's worth learning, it's worth remembering. And so I would argue for a combination of decodable texts and what I usually referred to are controlled vocabulary readers. That is, books that aren't going to have that many different words, but they're going to repeat those individual words a lot. I think of the old Basil readers, the Dick and Jane kind of thing. Look, 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 run, Dick, run, that kind of thing. Where, well, those are kind of silly. Uh-huh. And decodable text can be kind of silly too. But the fact is, they help kids to build those basic reading skills. And once they have those, then you have a lot more free reign to be able to say, now I want kids to deal with some other kinds of complexity, more language complexity and content complexity, not so much decoding complexity. And so you can like I say, certainly by the beginning of second grade, most kids are ready to go. You still might have some laggards, and that's, very reasonable to protect them for a little while. But at some point, they really need to shift over to the grade level stuff.
I'm sure that's very helpful for the kinder and first grade teachers who are listening, that they don't need to make all the changes. I mean, we've come a really long way with decodable text, but I do think a lot of companies have taken it a little bit too far, to your point of just like trying to go for 100% decodability. And it doesn't make a very interesting story, first of all. And then
No, it doesn't make an interesting story, and it also has the tendency to mislead the kids to think that the system is 100% consistent when it's conditional. Where, gee, this pattern works 67% of the time, but that means a third of the time when I come to this pattern, I've got to know what my alternatives are, or I have to remember that this is exceptional. And if kids don't learn that, they don't become very good readers. And
yeah.
so this notion of we want everything to be perfectly decodable really can do some harm in the long run.
What about, so you mentioned controlled vocabulary. Is that similar to repetitive text where every page is look at the
Mm.
boat, look at the bike? I'm sure you've seen these
No,
too.
I'm so glad you asked that. I actually enjoy working with those kinds of books with kids. They're fun to read to kids. I like them to as a starting point for some beginning writing. But for teaching reading, they're really lousy because, in fact, they discourage kids from looking at the words.
Mm.
Brown bear, what do you see? I see a yellow duck looking at me. Yellow duck, what do you see? By the time you get to the third stanza of that, kindergartners are reciting it, but
Oh,
they
my
don't have the text
2-year-old can
in front
recite
of them.
that.
Yeah, but they don't have the text in front of them. And that's what happens. And so when you go, oh, I went to the store and ate ice cream. I went to the store and ate candy. I went to the store and it's the kids are just looking at the picture to figure out what the one word is. They're not looking at the word, and they're certainly not looking at the other words. And the teachers go, oh, that's great. They're reading. Well, no, they're not really reading, and they're not even doing anything that's like reading, because you don't guess the words from pictures and you do need to look at all the words. So I would really discourage the use of those kinds of pattern books or those repetitive sentences So you want repetitive words. And so that means the sentences have to be more varied than that. That requires you to actually go and read. Oh, I went to the store. I went to the store with my friend Millie. My friend Millie ate ice cream. It's whoa, it's more complicated. I had ice cream too, and so you're repeating a lot of the words. Millie and I like ice cream. Uh, we like to go to the store. You go, wow, you're repeating a lot of words. I am, but not sentences. And so the kids are having to actually figure out what each of the words is. And that's where the decodability should be helping. That's where the word repetition should be helping. Gee, they didn't teach ice cream, but the word ice that those two words ice cream came up 6 times in 9 pages. Wow, the kids saw that a lot. And in fact, a lot of them were reading it much faster by the third or fourth time because they'd seen it before. I hope it comes up in the next story too. A very different story, perhaps, but that also repeats it. You want to avoid texts that have a lot of what the researchers refer to as singletons, words that are only going to come up once or
Mhm.
twice, and you're just not going to see it again. Those just overwhelm kids. They make the text harder without actually facilitating the kids learning anything about reading the content either. So,
So those store I'm
but
calling them story words or story vocabulary. It sometimes kids do, I hate to use the word memorization because it's seen as, a bad word now, but
mm,
sometimes they do just memorize those words. They haven't mastered
absolutely.
that phonics yet, but to your point, they see ice cream in a decodable book besides the word ice cream, and maybe the teacher front loaded, this is the word ice cream. You're going to see it a bunch of times in this book. So sometimes it is okay to just memorize words if that phonics scheme isn't available to you yet.
It absolutely is, and it's even okay to memorize some words that fit the phonics scheme that you have the kids try to read. But now I want you to see them often enough that, frankly, they're automatic for you, that you're not having to sound them out or figure them out. We don't really know what goes into memory. Some people, there've been claims over the years that it's patterns, and that's, decoding fits that very nicely. That you learn those patterns. I can see that there's a silent E at the end of this word, and so that's it's that kind of thing. Some people used to think it was rules, but there's some reasons to think that maybe not. And some people believe, no, you learn the words. You put
Mhm.
those words in memory, and your brain is, when it comes to a new word, it's kind of sorting through and looking for something that's similar to it in some ways. My hunch is it's a lot of different things that go into memory. And so yeah, kids are learning patterns, but they're also learning words. And so it's okay to memorize words or to see some words often enough. Uh, you taught first grade, you know what it's like. Beginning of the year, you try to teach words to kids. It can take a long time for,
Mhm.
oh, we did 15 repetitions and little Johnny still didn't know it the next day. Or he knew it the first day, but he didn't know it the second day. What's going on? By mid-year, gosh, I introduce a word once or twice and the kids, it sticks in their memory. What's going on? What's going on is whatever they're reshaping the memory system to be able to remember words and to connect words to what's in print, and they get better and better at that. That's what we mean by sight vocabulary. They look at a word, they know what it is immediately, and so we're not teaching them phonics so they can sound out words, so that's what they do initially. You're really reshaping how they think about words so that when they see them, they put them into memory in a useful way. And I think that's what phonics gives you. Without phonics, kids memorize words and then they have to figure out the pattern themselves, which works, but not quite as well. Fewer kids get it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Some
and
some
so
kids can do that very well and others not.
Exactly, and that's the problem. And so, if we could predict ahead of time, if I could tell you, well, little Janie here is going to be able to figure that out, and so you don't need to teach her phonics. And little Jimmy, he's going to need a real heavy dose of it. That would be terrific. But the fact is, we don't know which kids need a bunch of it and which need a little bit and which can, get by with less or more. And so it's really important that everybody get an opportunity. And that's where that explicit instruction becomes so important for those beginners. We don't want to mislead them, though. And that's where too much decodability or too consistent a set of spelling patterns and not enough attention to the memorization aspects of all this can be problematic for at least some of the kids.
Very helpful for teachers. Um, so we talked about instructional text. That's what you're using to teach reading. What about leisure reading? Should students be reading texts that are easy or independent level for them during their leisure time, or should they still be tackling challenging texts, or does it matter?
Well, we've always assumed and had some evidence showing that the lowest readers tend to take harder books. And of course, that makes sense that they would take harder books than they can read. If you can't read very well, most books are going to be harder. And so, just by chance, you're gonna pick more of those. Uh, but what the studies actually show is even the best readers don't select books at their independent level. Our good readers don't want to read books at their independent level. They want to read harder books. And so they tend to go, kids tend to choose what is aspirational, what they want to
Mm.
be able to read. And there's nothing wrong with that. That can actually lead to a lot of learning. In my book, one of the things I share a kind of a vignette of a librarian who's dealing with this. The kids want to take books out of the library, and here's this, little kid who comes up and says, here's the book I want to take out this week. And the librarian looks and goes, he can't read that. That's way too hard for him. And so typically what they do is tell them no. You got to go pick something else. And oh, no, 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 don't do that. One, you could just let him give it a try. If you're really worried about it and don't think it's going to give him practice reading, that he's going to end up just looking at the pictures, you might say something to him like, "Oh, you're interested in World War II? That book's going to be really hard for you. I think you should try it, but would you like me to find another one easier just
Mm.
in case it's too hard? You could take both of them out this week. That would be one kind of thing. Or, Johnny, if you find that it's too hard for you and you'd like something easier on that, you'd let me know and I'll help you find one. Either of those would be good. And when parents are dealing with it, I'd argue for something very similar. Oh, Johnny, we can get that book. No, no problem. But I think that's going to be a book we're going to have to read together. Would you like one that you could, read on your own? Or I think you should get a second book that you could read on your own. Let's see if we can find something like that. But I wouldn't discourage the youngster from trying to take on the harder book. And I can remember when I was giving talks about this uh, when the Common Core came on, and a number of teachers would raise their hand and say, "You know what you're talking about? I, my kids often struggled with reading, but the Harry Potter books,
Mhm.
everybody had to read those. And I had my lowest readers carrying those books around on the playground. They were reading them and struggling with those books, but they wanted everybody to know they were reading it and they were part of the group. And boy, I wouldn't ever discourage kids from trying to do that. I tried to do that kind of stuff as a kid, and sometimes didn't understand what I was reading. Oh well, but it was aspirational, and I was trying things out, and in fact, I kept doing that, and it allowed me to read harder books over time. And so I'd really discourage folks from telling kids for their independent reading, their leisure reading, that they have to read certain kinds of books or certain levels of books. But I would give the kids some options and some support as well.
This is so refreshing to hear. It aligns very well with Reading as Fundamental's mission because we're about choice and access. And when we host book celebration events, that's when we put out books for home ownership. We specifically tell the librarian or educator, whoever's facilitating the event, do not level the books. If you want to organize the books in such a way, you can organize them at tables around interest topics or genres for students, but do not level them. Never say to a child, you can only get books from the green table because that's your reading level, because it's about choice. And I think some of the research in your book highlights that when you do self-select a book, you're more motivated to read it. You're able to take on a more challenging text, like your Harry Potter example.
Studies back to the 1950s always showed that when kids were selecting the books, they could read books that were harder than their instructional level or their independent level. And so, this is something we've actually known for a very long time, and yet you do see people still putting limits on what they allow kids to read, and boy, what a bad idea. So I cheer for RIF Fun on doing that and encouraging people to share books with kids in that way.
Thank you. So a big question for you. I mean, I knew when I picked up this book and read it, it was life-changing to me as somebody who works in the field of literacy. It caused me to question some of the practices that I did as a first grade teacher and some of the ways that I create content now. Um, it's this leveled reading. It's a culture almost. It's deeply embedded
Mhm.
in curriculums, in assessments, in teacher training. What changes do you think policymakers, school level leaders need to prioritize to improve this?
Yeah, I think clearly just mandating this, which is what happened with Common Core. States mandated this and then didn't do anything. They didn't invest very much in teacher education. They didn't. So I would really suggest that the number one thing they've got to do is, the books are there now. That isn't the hard part of it. No, they don't have to throw out the book rooms and so on. But what they do need to do is they have to make sure that teachers, one, understand that this is holding kids back, that somebody has to take the time to show them and explain to them why this is a problem. And two, somebody has to take the time to provide the teacher development, the professional learning that will allow them to see, well, what can you do? There's nothing more frustrating for a teacher than to see a youngster in their classroom struggling to read a book, that just seemingly can't do it. They don't know what to do with that. And you're never going to mandate somebody into knowing something. You're going to have to invest in making sure that those teachers know what the alternatives are. And as your earlier question points out, and it's not just the reading teachers, it's what about the science teachers and the social studies teachers? It's not just the second and third grade teachers, it's the teachers all the way up to 12th grade. How do you work with a text that the students are going to struggle with? And to make that productive and to make the kids successful with that. And so, I honestly think this is one where the biggest changes have to be in teacher education.
Mm.
Uh, so states making sure that their professional development programs at the universities are addressing this issue. School district, the curriculum director, the head of professional development for a district, those folks need to, uh, uh, you know, start thinking about, gee, we've been doing a lot of phonics stuff. This is really about comprehension. How would we teach teachers to do the kinds of things that Tim Shanahan's talking about? Uh, what's the guidance we can give around vocabulary? What's the guidance we can give around building fluency? What's the guidance we can give about dealing with complex sentences? What's the guidance we can give in dealing with discourse structure? And on and on and on. Uh, Think of anything that can block your comprehension of a text. How would you scaffold it without telling somebody what the text says, without reading the text to them? How could you, what kind of guidance could you give that would allow a person to succeed with the text? And I think you'd find there are a bunch of things we can do. There's a lot of areas that have actually been researched. And so that's why my book, there's a whole chapter on what do you do in terms of the words and the fluency. There's another chapter. What do you do with all the language and the content stuff? There's another chapter. What do you do to make sure that it stays motivational? Kids prefer the harder text, but they need to succeed with it. And so teachers have to know how to make that successful. And so that, I put at least the bare bones of what's needed there. Teachers need to see some of that stuff in action. And I think that's really up to the instructional leaders at the state level, at the district level, the school level, and certainly at the universities. That isn't happening to a sufficient extent right now.
Thank you, Dr. Shanahan. I'm hopeful that it will. I see good momentum right now in the literacy landscape and a lot of policies being implemented. So hopefully this will happen. I always end by asking my guest, what does reading inspire for you?
Wow. I tend to, when I'm reading for pleasure, I tend to read history, or I tend to I read literature, but I read literature. I don't tend to read the hot books right now. I mean, I read some of that, but I tend to read more of what's considered the literary canon. I recently read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. I'm reading the Forsyte Saga. I'm in the final book of that. Well, that was published in 1927. What do I guess what I'd say is that what reading inspires for me is I see myself connecting myself to the past,
Hmm.
to the chain of humanity and the problems that we've faced and sometimes ducked or failed to face. Um, I think there's a lot to be learned from the challenges that humans have confronted in the past, both on a large level, like history tends to be, nationally, or those kinds of things. But literature deals with problems at a real, personal level,
Hmm.
and you get to see. I wasn't long ago, I was reading a story, a Nathaniel Hawthorne story, probably written in the 1830s or 40s, and it was about child molesting.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, gee, we treat that like that's like a new issue. All the stuff on that. Every day you're reading about somebody has done some bad thing to
Mhm.
a kid someplace, sometimes a teacher or somebody in the scout, ooh, horrible stuff. And you go, wait a minute, that was 200 years ago.
Hmm.
And he was writing about that openly. I can't believe it. That when I was a child, we didn't know anything about that. And so I think there's a value to being able to connect yourself with that whole group of people who came before us. There's much to learn from them. I think we could do better if we knew more about that. So that tends to be where my reading goes. And there's some wonderful stuff out there.
Yes. And the great thing
Great
is
books.
there's more and more, every year
There's
more
more and
books
more.
are published. You can read the hot and new, or you can time travel and read the classics.
Absolutely. And I've got a daughter who's very literary. She has a degree in English from Kenyon. So so she gives me some of the more modern, contemporary books, that are on, science fiction or, all these kinds of dystopian
Mm,
worlds that people are confronting. So I get a little of that because if she gives it to me, I read it. Fathers and daughters. But
that's
yeah,
wonderful.
I'm not completely bereft of modern and contemporary literature, but my preference tends to be these older pieces that have been around for a while and allow, like you say, time travel or me to connect with a group of people I'd never be able to connect with otherwise.
Yeah. Connection. Well, thank you, Dr. Shanahan. It was wonderful to connect with you today, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Please keep doing the work you guys do.
Thank you for listening to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I hope today's conversation sparked new ideas, meaningful connections, and a renewed love of reading. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with a fellow literacy champion, and join us next time as we continue exploring what reading inspires.